He scrubbed the floor alone. No one knew his name, and no one asked. Each morning, before the sun even crept over the Missouri horizon, he was there, diligent, silent, as if he had never existed. But when a young Navy SEAL officer caught sight of the faint tattoo peeking from beneath his sleeve and whispered, "Sir," the entire room fell silent. For the man they'd ignored all those years, should have died 20 years ago, had been standing right in front of them. If stories like this send chills down your spine, stay tuned. What happens next will change the way you see a janitor forever. There's a man who appears in the same place, at the same hour, for years, so long that no one even remembers the first time he set foot here. Each morning, before the alarm bells awaken the command rows, he's already on duty, silent, prompt, so regular he nearly seems unreal. No one greets him, no one asks about him. He simply glides by as if part of the corridor itself, familiar, worn, and easily forgotten. His name is Frank Darrow, yet at Whiteman Air Force Base, they don't call him by his real name. He's the old man who never smiles. They whisper it each time he passes, never cruelly, simply out of habit. Busy people never bothering to look behind a silent face. On his gray coveralls, the name tag on his chest has faded until only faint curves remain. No one stands long enough to read it, nor do they think it matters. Frank doesn't need anyone's attention. He expects no glance, doesn't yearn for a question. Long ago, he learned to live as part of the wall, unresponsive, unnoticed, yet always present. Routine is his last armor. Each morning at exactly 4 o'clock, he leaves his windowless room behind Warehouse 3. Across the cold concrete apron, he pushes his familiar cart, its misaligned wheels whining softly, unnoticed by all. His journey begins in the East Wing. He mops each tile in a fixed pattern, as though they're squares on a chessboard he's played thousands of games on. He never varies his route, never. The corners he cleans first are always those nearest the emergency exits. At every door he passes, he tests the handle with a light, fleeting touch, enough to tell if anyone's opened it before him. People often assume he's just a creature of habit. But anyone who's lived through war understands. Routines are a means of survival. Doors are places where the enemy can appear. Long corridors become traps if you can't control your escape routes. For Frank, mopping the floor isn't merely cleaning. It's a terrain check. It's memorizing every smallest change. A fallen piece of paper, a new shadow, an unfamiliar echo. He rarely uses his left hand. It stays hidden in his coat pocket, even when there's no need to conceal it. If anyone were curious enough to look, they'd see jagged scars twisting around his knuckles, like barbed wire wrapped tight around bone and flesh. Those scars aren't simply marks of time. They're the testament to a night that lasted a lifetime. A night when Frank crawled out of a bomb crater, dragging 2 wounded soldiers with one hand and a singed radio in the other. But no one asks, and he doesn't volunteer the story. Frank never makes conversation. He never smiles, never complains. He just does his job, repeatedly, without deviation, without expecting anything from anyone. New arrivals at the base think he can't speak. The long-timers forget he exists. He's like the murmur of the ventilation system, there, yet never truly heard. Yet if someone is patient enough to look a little longer, they'll notice something unusual. Those eyes, opaque gray and fathomless, never cast down like an ordinary janitor's. They sweep the hallways like thermal scanners, detecting, cataloging, comparing. The eyes of a man who once led his comrades across a kill zone, where a single blink could have left them all behind. Frank Darrow learned to survive by revealing nothing of himself, and in doing so, he became invisible. Not because he was never there, but because he chose never to be seen. That morning was no different from 100 others. The clatter of boots echoed down the main corridor, heralding a group of newcomers, perhaps a tour party or young officers fresh from the front lines. To Frank, they were like passing gusts of wind, loud, fleeting, leaving only a vague echo behind. He did not look up. He simply dipped his mop into his bucket, wringing it out with a motion he had perfected through endless repetition. Their chatter was lively, punctuated by laughter and the occasional mild swear. Jokes only those recently returned from hell dared to make. They were young, far too young to understand the true cost of survival. Frank did not need to see them to know who they were. The way they strode, half showy, half careless, said it all. He had once been that man. He had once marched with chest thrust forward as if bullets could not pierce bone. But feet like that rarely stayed that way for long, or changed very quickly. Then one pair of boots stopped. The sole ground to silence in the wide hallway. It was not loud, nor called for. It was merely a tiny pause, enough to interrupt the racket. Frank felt it before he heard it. He did not turn, yet he knew those eyes were on him, holding, studying. Not the curiosity of a stranger, but the recognition of something familiar, something that ought not to appear here, at this moment. Frank lifted his arm, raising his mop to wring it out. His sleeve rode up just a little, and there, in an instant, was the tattoo faded by time. Tidy characters inked on skin. JTAC Echo 3, Fallujah 005. The young soldier saw it, and suddenly, the world went silent. He stood frozen, shoulders tense. His lips moved in what might have been a whisper, yet Frank heard every syllable, not because it was loud, but because it carried the weight of memory. "Sir." Frank turned his head, not hurriedly, not hesitantly, simply lifted it, as though an old habit had been roused. His gray, opaque eyes met those of the young officer, a wordless look, yet carrying something undeniable. Recognition, not of identity or rank, but of essence. Between them lay 8 paces of corridor, yet in that gaze spanned a generation, a past, something ancient and sacred beyond words. Frank was not surprised, nor did he look away. His eyes held neither fear nor anger. They were as still as a deep lake, where all lies submerged, yet remains present. Luke Ramsey. Frank did not know that name, but he recognized the familiarity in those eyes. Doubt crushed by astonishment. An unbidden respect no one had taught. The truth the young man had glimpsed, rendering every drill, every tactical lesson suddenly pale. Frank knew that expression. He'd seen it in the mirror years before, when he first noticed the scar whose origin he could not recall. The feeling of confronting a buried truth, not the truth in a file, but the truth long stifled, then surfacing like ink bleeding across white cloth. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then the group of young soldiers moved on, unaware that one of their number had just faced a buried chapter of history. Only Luke remained, eyes fixed on the tattoo he had barely glimpsed. Frank turned away first. He said nothing. He did not nod nor confirm. He set his mop back on the floor and resumed his work as though nothing had happened. Yet deep in his chest, something shifted. Not emotion, not regret, but something very much like rebirth. It had been so long, so very long, since anyone had addressed him as Sir. 20 years ago, Frank Darrow wasn't gripping a mop in a cold hallway. He was holding a field locator and communications gear on the battlefield. He didn't walk with the slow, shadowed steps of a man learned to hide. He was the first to traverse brutal terrain, delivering precision fire coordination orders to exact coordinates. Master Sergeant, a rank few bear, especially in a rapid response unit where every command could mean life or death. That mission in Fallujah once seemed a routine tracking op, yet the deeper Frank dug, the more he sensed something amiss. He was the first to notice the comm maps didn't align, the signals of unclear origin, the data packets with off-pattern encryption. Not enemy transmissions, but from somewhere very close, behind them. Then they found proof. The logs. The snippets of encrypted chatter. Documents showing a secret comm link between certain U.S. military contractors and the insurgents themselves. Not a careless betrayal, but deliberate treachery. U.S. troop locations traded for money, for profit. Frank knew they had to report it, but he also knew what would happen if someone preferred that truth stay buried. And sure enough, before they could exit the comm net, the blast tore through the air. The entire unit ambushed. An insider strike, not from the enemy, but from the very leak they sought to expose. Frank survived, but not unscathed. He awoke to a shattered leg, blood everywhere, and two comrades gasping their last breaths beside him. No rescue in sight, no guidance, only a single faint radio frequency, and a scorched radio stinking of melted plastic. He had to crawl, nearly 400 meters across sand, blood, and fire. Under a hail of stray bullets, he dragged two young soldiers as though pulling the last fragments of his own soul. Not because of orders, but because if he'd left them behind, the last piece of his humanity would have died with them. Days later, he opened his eyes in a military hospital. Harsh white light, the beeping of ventilators, the smell of antiseptic. His left leg was ruined, and of the two men he'd dragged from hell, only one survived. Before he could walk again, two men in black suits appeared. No greeting, no expression. They laid out folders on the bedside table, copies, pre-written statements, documents stamped by agencies whose names Frank had never heard. They didn't need him dead. They only needed his silence. No threats were spoken, yet their eyes conveyed the warning that if he spoke out, everyone would turn away. That he would be branded a deranged soldier, inventing treason, endangering national security. That he would be written off as useless, abandoned by the very military for which he had bled. The choice was no real choice at all. Frank fell silent. He refused to sign the papers, offered no reply, but met them with eyes that had seen too much to be frightened. Yet in his heart, he understood. What he carried from Fallujah was not a scar, nor the dull ache each time the wind changed. It was a secret, and the price of that secret was to disappear. He was struck from the active roster. His records were reclassified and locked away, his medical files reassigned to a phantom recovery program. A week later, he was discharged in a civilian vehicle to a place that did not appear on any military map. No medals, no identity, no past. Frank Darrow, Master Sergeant, Fire Control Specialist of Echo 3, officially ceased to exist. And so he learned to stay silent, not out of fear, but because he knew that if the truth was not allowed to live, then its keeper could not remain either. Dear viewers, take a moment to relax or sip some water before the next surprising twist. And please let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see viewers joining us from around the world. Comment 1 if you found this story compelling so we can continue bringing you more powerful tales. 20 years is long enough to render a man invisible, long enough for a name once carved on the battlefield to fade into a blurred patch on coveralls, long enough for everyone to believe he no longer exists. But secrets do not vanish with time. They merely slumber until someone awakens them. The white man network began to glitch. Data packets were copied. Anonymous access into high-level servers. No firewall ever breached. No trace of outside intrusion. Everything was executed from within the system, by someone who knew it like the palm of his hand, someone who had no business being there, someone who had once been part of that system and was now using it to dismantle itself from the inside. In a midnight meeting, when all investigations had stalled, one name was spoken, not by the newcomers, but by a former security officer who'd served on Iraq's front lines. The name dropped onto the conference table like a stone thrown into a perfectly still lake. Darrow. The room fell silent. Some didn't know who that was. Some remembered only vaguely. But those who truly knew understood that, if that name still lived, he had never been a passive man. The next morning, a colonel from the Pentagon appeared on base. No honor guard, no escort, just a crisp uniform and a high-level security badge. He strode straight to the supply warehouse, redolent of cleaning chemicals and stacks of paper rolls. Frank Darrow was there, auditing inventory. His gaze remained downward, the marker in his hand methodically crossing off tiny squares in a yellowed logbook. "We need you," the colonel's voice said from behind, neither raised nor harsh, yet heavy enough to silence the ceiling fans. Frank did not turn. He did not flinch. He merely set aside the stack of paper. "I'm already dead," he replied, flatly, as if reading a cleaning solution label. "They told me to disappear, so I did." The colonel stepped closer, holding a thick dossier, its edges dog-eared. His face was as impassive as wood, yet his eyes held something beyond mere orders. The truth. "The man behind Fallujah," he said slowly, "may be the one behind these recent breaches. He's still alive." Frank paused mid-mark. The warehouse air seemed to freeze. No sound broke the hush except the spinning fan. His hand stayed on the paper, yet he did not move. His eyes stared at the rough concrete wall as though looking through it, to another place, another time. Fallujah. Scorching sand, choking smoke, a scorched radio, and 2 bleeding soldiers by his side. Then he turned around. No questions needed. No further briefing. Everything he had tried to bury sprang to life. Cold steel of memory pressed against his skin. Fractured dreams, nights woken by phantom calls. The name he'd interred, the prosthetic leg he wore each day, all born of that moment. "Then," Frank said softly, "you'd best tell me everything." Not because he wished to return, not because he still craved justice, but because some debts never vanish on their own. And if the man who doomed his unit to the brink of death still walks free, still pulls strings in the shadows, then silence is no longer an option. His gray, opaque eyes locked on the colonel's. In that instant, the officer understood. Frank Darrow had never truly disappeared. He had merely stepped back. And when old ghosts stir, the last keeper of the flame must come home. Frank carried no weapons, no gun, no knife, no rank insignia. What he carried was memory, etched into his mind over 2 decades. What he had learned, what he had witnessed, what he had survived, had now become a silent weapon, keener than any bayonet. In the 3 weeks following that meeting in the supply warehouse, he spoke to no one of what he knew. He asked no questions. He merely watched in silence. like a ghost drifting through corridors everyone was used to seeing but never really noticing. He did not alter his routine. He still cleaned by the same schedule. He still mopped the floors at the familiar hour. Yet each step now carried purpose. Frank began to track security badge scans at doors earlier than scheduled. Files opened before the system's official operating hours. Fleeting intrusions into internal servers that seemed harmless, yet probed into data partitions a mere accident could never reach. He recorded it all, not with software, but with the intuition of a man forged in a battlefield where every miscalculation bled men dry. Who left the office too early, who stayed too late, who habitually touched his chin when lying, who changed shift schedules without reason. Gradually, the pieces began to fit together. One name surfaced from the data maze. Thomas Kellard, Senior Technical Advisor. A name that had flickered past Frank's files years ago, among the hundreds of blackout documents in the Iraq dossier. Then, just a blurred face behind press briefings. Someone who issued no orders, yet knew too much, appeared at the right moment, and vanished at the right place. Frank remembered those eyes, deep, cold, unnervingly calm amid the ruins. Now the man was here again. Not a mere shadow, but the one pulling strings from within the system. On Thursday night, Frank stood alone in the rear parking lot of the administrative building, where the lights barely illuminated the ground, and the night wind cut through the emptiness. He stood between two vehicles, his shadow stretching behind him, silent as part of the darkness. Thomas Kellard emerged from the building, his coat draped over one arm, a neat leather briefcase clutched under his other elbow. He walked as he had 100 times before, confident, impassive, never glancing back. But this time, he stopped when he saw the figure blocking his car. Frank did not move an inch. The moment of recognition lasted only half a second, but that half second was enough to change Kellard's face. Not with fear, but with realization. A recognition he could not deny. That the past he had buried stood before him. That the ghost he thought long hidden was looking straight into his eyes, with eyes that had known betrayal even before it had a name. "You were supposed to be dead," Kellard said. His voice did not tremble, yet it cut cold. Frank did not answer at once. He stared at the man who had left his unit behind in Fallujah, stared as if counting every crack in the other's character. "Many good men are," he said quietly, "but only some are worthy." In that statement was no anger, only a truth, cold and irreversible. Kellard offered no retort, no defense. Men like him always know when the game is over, and tonight, the final piece had fallen. Distant police headlights flared. Unmarked vehicles arrived from multiple directions. Investigators stepped out, silent, swift, precise, as though following a meticulously staged script. Frank did not turn to watch the ending. He did not need to witness its close. For him, the essential part had already occurred. The rest no longer belonged to him. He walked slowly toward the side gate. No one called his name. No one asked him to stay for a statement. They knew. The man before them was not merely a witness. He was the reason the case could finally be closed. And once more Frank Darrow vanished into the darkness. But this time, he carried with him something he had not had 20 years ago: choice. There were no news broadcasts, no press conferences, not a single line in any military journal about the man who had unmasked a traitor after 2 decades of anonymity. Everything was handled in silence, neatly, swiftly, precisely, as the system had once tried to make Frank vanish. But this time, the system could not erase what he had done. At Whiteman, Security protocols were tightened. Internal access pathways were thoroughly audited. Every link in the operational chain was re-examined. Reports once ignored were now read word for word. No one mentioned Frank by name. No one attached him to any of the changes. Yet somewhere in each document, his trace remained, silent as his presence had been for all those years. Frank returned to his cart, as though he had never left. The same familiar corridor tiles, the same steady footfalls. But something had changed, not in the base, but within himself. He no longer avoided others' glances. He no longer looked down as he passed the young officers. And in the eyes of those who knew, there was now something different. A guarded respect, perhaps even a tinge of fear, but most of all, recognition. They were beginning to see him, no longer as part of the furnishings. That morning, as he emptied a trash bin outside the operations center, a familiar voice called from behind. He need not turn. Frank knew exactly who it was. Luke Ramsey had returned, not the stunned young officer who once froze at the sight of a tattoo, but now a man standing tall, his gaze steady, his voice assured. In his hand was a small plaque, shiny metal, each letter carefully engraved. He placed it in Frank's hand without a word of introduction. The plaque simply read, "They used to call you a legend. Now, at least someone remembers your name." Frank said nothing. His calloused hand brushed the engraving as though touching an old scar, healed, yet still aching when the wind shifted. A slow smile spread across his weathered face, not forced nor held back, but genuine, the first in 20 years. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he whispered. And for the first time, he did not correct the rank. For Frank, the name, the rank, even the medals buried somewhere in a Colorado warehouse, no longer mattered. But to be called by his true title, even once, was enough to remind him that he still existed, not merely as a shadow in the corridor. There was no applause, no music. But in that moment, something was soothed. A part of a soul long frozen by loss, betrayal, and silence had finally been reached. Frank went back to his work, mopping the floor, organizing supplies, jotting neat notes in his dog-eared logbook. But from that day on, people sometimes saw him linger longer by the hallway window, staring out at the airfield where planes took off, not to keep watch, but to remember. And from then on, newcomers to the base heard a whispered story of an old gate guard who vanished from history, only to return when he was needed most. A ghost once called a legend. That story may not be in any book, but it lives on in memory, in respect, and in the retelling by those who understand. Some sacrifices need no entries. They only need not be forgotten. If you followed this far and something in Frank Darrow's story, a silent man who was never truly invisible, a soldier forgotten yet never diminished, has touched you, please leave a comment below. We want to know where and when you're watching. Share this tale with loved ones, especially those who've served in the U.S. military, so they know there are others like them who lived, who fought, who stayed silent, but were never forgotten. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to spread stories that must be heard, because some heroes only need to be listened to once.